Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. He's a history major at Rice University. You may have seen him on Real Time with Bill Maher. Unlike our other speakers, probably not a drop of gray or silver on his head. Please help me welcome Zack Kopplin with Second Giant Leap.
I'm supposed to be here, right? All right. Hey, everyone. Thank you all so much for having me here, and I'm really thrilled to tell you about our fight for science in Louisiana and all around the country. And my home state is addicted to creationism. In 1987, the Supreme Court threw out our first creationism law in the, let me move this for a second, sorry, I'm moving the mouse around. Threw out our first creationism law in the Edwards versus Aguilar case. And despite that, despite the first lesson we should have learned back in '87, we've passed a new creationism law in 2008, the Louisiana Science Education Act. And this law, it's really clever. It doesn't ever mention creationism or intelligent design to dodge court rulings like Edwards or the more recent Kitzmiller versus Dover case, which invalidated intelligent design as creationism and still equally unconstitutional. Instead, it just allows evolution to be critiqued as a controversial theory, because evolution is very, very controversial to Louisiana politicians. Not so much to scientists, but to Louisiana politicians. So it never says creationism. In fact, it has this big disclaimer on the end that says this is not to promote for or against religion. The problem is that this is exactly what it does. And so, because of this law, you could teach in a Louisiana classroom that the Earth is 6,000 years old, that dinos live with humans, and as long as you couched it as critiquing evolution to help students think critically, it's legal. And so the thing is, you don't need this law to teach critical thinking in public school science classrooms. All the defenders of the law say it's all about critical thinking, but you don't need a law to do that. If you're teaching kids a scientific method and teaching them evolution, they're going to learn how to think critically. But when you have this law that mandates that, theoretically, all it really does is allow non-science in the classroom.
So the Louisiana Science Education Act sponsor, Senator Ben Nevers, said that the law was for creationism. He was asked before the law passed, why are you doing this? And he said the local religious rights group, the Louisiana Family Forum, asked him to sponsor the law because they wanted creation taught wherever Darwin's theory was addressed. So that's pretty blatant. And Governor Bobby Jindal, the governor who signed the law, he was asked in April, what about the teaching of creationism in public school science classes? And he had an answer about that. He told Education Nation that we have what's called the Science Education Act that says if a teacher wants to supplement these materials, if the school board's okay with that, if the state school board's okay with that, they can supplement these materials. And what he meant is, he says, I've got no problem if a school board, a local school board, says we want to teach our kids about creationism, that some people have these beliefs as well. Let's teach them about intelligent design. He asked, what are we afraid of? And so it's become pretty clear. The sponsor of this law and the governor who signed it said it's for creationism. So I tend to trust them. Now, the Discovery Institute, which is a religious right creationist think tank based in Seattle, they say that Governor Jindal is confused about the Louisiana Science Education Act, and he doesn't know that's actually for creationism. It's a little suspicious since they're creationists in the first place, and they're just trying to protect their law, I think. But I think Governor Jindal's a smart man. I think he knows exactly what he was doing when he signed this law to allow creationism in the classroom. He was pandering to the religious right, and that's what it's for. So I think he knows exactly what he means when he says that this law is for creationism. And so when this law was first passed, it had to go before a state board of education for implementation rules. And our state board knew what it was about, and they wrote a policy that banned the teaching of creationism and intelligent design in Louisiana schools under this law. And so that sounds good until the religious right got a hold of it. And the religious right went berserk, and that policy got scrapped. So that was the last defense against the teaching of creationism in Louisiana, and that no longer exists. And so now we have school boards like Livingston Parish in Louisiana, which has said this law is for, quote, critical thinking and creationism. They said they didn't want a lawsuit, but they were willing to take one for Jesus. And they really wanted someone with religious beliefs in a science classroom to teach creationism. That was what they wanted. And they wanted to make creationism part of the curriculum. We've had other parishes across the state discuss teaching creationism with this law. So we know exactly what it's for. Despite the fact that it's written fairly cleverly and written to avoid a court case, it's really clear what they're doing with this law. And we've got some example supplemental materials that could be used in Louisiana classrooms. They say things like the Cambrian explosion can't be explained. There are major gaps in the fossil record. If we get even more, those are some of the supplemental materials. The super crazy ones come from places like creationevidence.info. Y'all can all go look it up. There's a woman who runs that website who testifies in Louisiana every single year in support of the Louisiana Science Education Act. And she says that dinos live with humans and recommends some stuff to be taught in Louisiana science classes under this law. Answers in Genesis, the stuff from the Creation Museum, the Institute for Creation Research. So that could be supplemented. Those things could critique established science in Louisiana under this law. Now, despite all this talk about critical thinking, it's fairly clear that this law is really about teaching creationism. And that's a problem because evolution is science. All the scientists, the overwhelming majority, and all of the evidence back the theory of evolution. And if you teach kids evolution is wrong, that's going to confuse them about science and the nature of the scientific method. Science is just, it's our best explanation and model for the natural world. We continue to test and retest things to see if they're right. There are specific conditions that when we test our explanations, if it comes back with certain results, we would know it's false and have to go back to the drawing board. Creationism meets none of that. And if you suddenly say this doesn't apply to evolution and creationism, what do you do in your physics class? What do you do in chemistry class? How do you know where the scientific method applies and what's real? It's going to hurt kids in all their science from now on if they learn creationism. And this isn't just a Louisiana problem. We see these bills introduced all across the country, usually about 10 a year. We've had bills passed in Louisiana, and also Tennessee passed a copycat law in 2012. These laws don't just attack evolution, they also attack climate change and cloning and origin of life. Those are what you see included in there, and it's spread for the first time in 2013. We saw a bill in Kansas that didn't target evolution, it just targeted climate change. This is a standard tactic of science deniers. You say that there's a controversy over the evidence and that all sides, and that it should be critiqued in science classes, and that's the angle. And we get made fun of in Louisiana, and I'm sure y'all hear some of that in Arkansas too, where people from outside our state say, well, it's just y'all's backward state, and who cares about you? This isn't just us. There's been bills introduced in New Hampshire, in Montana, in Colorado, in Florida, all around the country. And so we really need to stand up wherever creationism gets brought up in America, and we need to fight against that. And that's what I've been doing. I grew up in Louisiana. I grew up in Louisiana. When I was a sophomore in high school, this law passed. And I kept waiting for an adult to stand up and take it on. I thought, this is silly. It will be gone before the end of the year. Someone's gonna fight it. Someone's gonna get rid of it. And everyone knows it's wrong. So I don't have to do anything. I can just wait. So I waited, and I became a junior. And I was a little surprised that nothing had happened. I checked. I was like, maybe I haven't looked at this in a while. Maybe it's just been gotten rid of while I wasn't paying attention. No. So I waited another year. And at that point, I was a senior in high school. And I realized that no one was actually taking this law on. No one wanted to fight it. No one seemed to care. And I realized if someone was going to fight it, it had to be me. I didn't know if I was going to leave state soon, and this was my last opportunity to take on the law. And the first step was to find a mentor, and that was Dr. Barbara Forrest, who was an expert witness at the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial in Pennsylvania, and luckily for me, lived about 25 minutes down the road in Louisiana. And Dr. Forrest is actually... She almost single-handedly proved that intelligent design was creationism and unconstitutional at Kitzmiller. And so I was extremely fortunate that she was close enough that she could help me, and I got in touch with her and I said, hey, I want to fight this. How do we get started? And so the first step after that was to find a legislative sponsor. And there was good news and bad news on that. And the bad news was that when the bill passed, it passed unanimously in our state Senate and with only 3 votes against it in the state House. So at least we knew where to go to find someone who was brave enough to oppose it. And that person was State Senator Karen Carter Peterson, who y'all will get to meet in video form in a few minutes. And Senator Peterson, she's now a senator. She was in the House when the law passed. And I got a meeting with her, and I started explaining, this is what the law does, this is why it's wrong. And she just stopped me. I was sitting in her office, and she said, you don't have to tell me, when do we get started? And that was the first step. And so the first year, we came in, we were fighting this fight. We gathered huge amounts of support. We had over 40 Nobel laureates on board with us in our first year, major science organizations, thousands of clergy, thousands of scientists, tens of thousands of people from all around the state, teachers, students. We built this wonderful coalition. The only group it was missing was Louisiana politicians. And so we came into committee and we lost 5-1. And let me introduce you to the reason we lost.
Most of the kids here would like to stand for is if you had asked, Would you prohibit
It wasn't what I asked.
I know.
And I am an attorney, and I listen patiently to all the accolades that everyone has behind, all the little letters behind their name, doctor, etc. So as an attorney, I'm asking a question, and I would like an answer to that question. Do you support, since you came to the table, do you support a law that prohibits the teaching of religion in the classroom?
Not in classes like English or history or comparative religions or philosophy class.
So you support the promotion of religion in an English class?
The Bible is always used in most English classes because it's a classic piece of literature.
Okay.
And promotion would be the key word in response.
Yeah.
Promotion would be, just if I could respond,
Go
I
ahead.
did listen patiently, and I appreciate that, Senator Quinn. And the only point I was trying to make is that if you want a response to your question, somebody needed to come to the mic so it could be on the record what the response was. And I don't think that any one individual, even Mr. Kopplin, can speak for everyone in the audience, and that probably...
That's kind of why I'm sorry to interrupt, but after listening to everyone, it seemed pretty clear that what they were espousing as a general concept was what they consider religious references as to creationism not being taught in the classroom. So I was rephrasing it. Then do you support a bill that prohibits the promotion, the teaching of religious beliefs in the classroom?
Well, the only thing that
they wouldn't even answer that.
Well, they weren't
directly
at the table, number one, but I don't think that, the instrument before Senate Bill 70 deals specifically with creationism in science classes, and that's why you see the plethora of people with little letters behind their name.
Big letters. I wasn't trying to be
Well, I just heard little letters.
disrespectful.
And I am very respectful of over 40 Nobel laureates. I'm very respectful of the Association of Biology Teachers. I'm very respectful of Louisiana Association of Biology Educators. I'm very respectful of Louisiana Science Teachers Association. I'm very respectful of the American Association of Advancement of Science, and I'm respectful of the American Institute of Biological Sciences, as well as American Society for Cell Biology and the Society for Vertebrate Paleontology. Lastly, the American Association of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. Half of this stuff I can't even enunciate, and yes, they have little, medium, and big letters behind their names, and they're all suggesting that we repeal the act.
That's Senator Peterson. She's absolutely amazing, isn't she? Yeah. So despite that speech there, we still lost 5-1 because as soon as Senator Quinn, the one who didn't really seem to understand people with little letters behind their names telling her what to do about science, she sort of led the charge against us and forced all the other senators on sides. And so luckily she's retired from the Senate now, and we don't have to see her on that committee anymore. So that's the good news there. So we lost that year, and everyone had told us that we're going to lose, and they told us, well, don't try again because you already lost 5-1. You know what the result is going to be, and just don't bother. And so we had editorials in the newspaper saying, well, the state's backwards. You're not going to fix this law until all these people retire and you get a whole new legislature in there. But we didn't listen to that, and we came back again. And I've learned something about the Louisiana legislature. So Senator Quinn was our first celebrity for saying silly things like little letters. But every year we have a new celebrity who makes themselves internet famous. And the second year was Senator Mike Walsworth, who it became very clear that he didn't understand what evolution actually was. But he had Google to tell him, and so he did lots of Googling. And one of the things he's Googled is how evolution works. Let me show you how he thinks evolution works.
I'll just give you the first. First sentence. Darwin's theory of evolution is a theory in crisis in light of the tremendous advances we've made in molecular biology, biochemistry, and genetics over the past 50 years.
Well, I just think you've proved a point that you can't trust what you get over the internet.
Let me ask you a question. There's not an experiment that you could
Yes, there is an
have
experiment.
in the classroom that would say, here's Darwin's theory of evolution,
There
and
is
this
an
proves it without a
Yes,
shadow of a doubt.
I will tell you about that. They have done experiments with E. coli bacteria, and they have taken those E. coli and they have taken different containers of them and they froze them in time, so that
How long of time? How long?
They just froze them over generations, years.
Oh, okay.
But this is an experiment.
Okay.
And so then they let the E. coli that are in the different vials continue to evolve. And then they take this group and they freeze it. And then they take this group and they freeze it. And then you can take all of them over time and compare them. And you can see how the E. coli have changed over time and how they evolved. But what's really interesting...
They evolve into a person?
No, they
Okay, I'm just asking how to get there. I'm just trying to figure out how to get there. But go ahead. I mean, so they change.
Person.
I think that's what we're talking about on.
Oh, but that's not what we're talking about.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
We're
I'm just trying to find out.
Evolution.
Yeah, absolutely.
So these E. coli.
How we got here.
So that was last year, and then this year. So that was Senator Walsworth, and he told us this year he's done his research. He read Wikipedia before the hearing this time, and he had gotten thousands of angry calls after that went viral on YouTube, and he wasn't going to say the same silly things again, but he did tell us they just skipped that chapter in high school when they taught evolution, and he didn't really know much about it, so it was okay. But this year we had Senator Guillory. Senator Guillory actually offers a fairly interesting explanation for why this law should be repealed that all the Christian fundamentalists should sort of take note of. And Senator Guillory had an experience with a witch doctor that he said he viewed the witch doctor's what the witch doctor did as science, and so the thing is, if that's an alternative science, and it's very interesting how he speaks about it and talks about it as different types of science, and this law allows that. It's just a critique, and so I would advise all the religious fundamentalists who are in Louisiana to take note of that and say, if we don't want witch doctors, if we don't want alchemy, if we don't want astrology in our science classes, maybe we should repeal this law, because it's just as silly as the witch doctor may sound to us, it is equally legitimate to creationism. So I'm going to introduce you to Senator Guillory. He tells a very, very good story about his experience with a witch doctor.
I'm concerned that we might shut off the presentation of ideas by
we have that
prematurely declaring one science or another science as pseudoscience. This doctor practiced in an open circle in a dusty spot. He wore no shoes, was semi-clothed, used a lot of bones that he threw around. Mm-hmm. I would bet that all of us would agree that his science is a pseudoscience. We would not have respect for his science and the practice of his science. That would concern me, because if we were able to declare what I have verified for myself as something that has some validity to it. I mean, the stuff the man told me about my history.
Yeah.
That yet, if I closed my mind when I saw this man in the dust, throwing some bones on the ground, semi-clothed, if I had closed him off and just said, that's not science, I'm not going to see this doctor, I would have shut off a very good experience for myself, and actually would not have discovered some things that he told me about what I needed to go and do when I got home.
So that was this spring, and we've gone from 5-1 loss in committee to a 3-2 loss. So we're making improvement now, and I think more calls to all these legislators about how people with little letters should be respected, and how evolution actually works. Because I still don't think Senator Walsworth, for example, understands that E. coli don't turn to people. It needs to be reminded. So I think that would help. But again, this is not just a Louisiana fight. These are the Louisiana legislators. But I live in Texas right now, and some of y'all may have heard about the Texas State Board of Education and its problem with science and also history. And So yeah, on history they want to get rid of. They want to take out Thomas Jefferson and slavery and feminism and various other things that most of us say happened, and take those out of the textbooks because they don't like them. The most offensive. They luckily failed. The most offensive line I think that came out of that board was that there was a quote overrepresentation of minorities in the history books, and so they wanted to remove Cesar Chavez, that's fairly disgusting. But so that's the history. But we're on a science year right now, and Texas is adopting science textbooks, and so Texas first is one of the largest states. It has 10% of the students in the country, which means that its textbooks often, when Texas adopts textbooks, publishers use what they sell to Texas everywhere else in the country, and Texas tends to try and change those textbooks. And so the State Board of Education, they already compromised the standards in Texas, and they've asked for all sides of scientific theories to be taught. In fact, do y'all remember when Governor Perry made news in 2012 saying Texas taught creationism? Do you know why he said that? Because Texas standards say all sides of theory should be taught. So it's already, as far as we know, happening in Texas classrooms. In fact, it just came out on Friday that there's a charter school, possibly many more, that is teaching creationism in Texas. And the justification for this, I'm sure, is that all sides of theories have to be taught. So education standards in Texas have been compromised already. But it gets even worse when those standards are used to dictate what textbooks are taught in Texas, or are bought in Texas. And so that's a problem. It gets even worse when the state board appoints the experts who are supposed to go through the textbook and find like errors and typos and correct things and offer recommendations to textbook companies. They appoint creationists who who are Discovery Institute fellows, the creationist think tank in Seattle, and are members of the Creation Science Hall of Fame. So these people are reviewing Texas biology textbooks that could be used across the country. And when you put people who are in the Creation Science Hall of Fame on your textbook review committee and leave them unopposed editing the checking the biology textbooks, they do things like say that biblical creation or biblical let me find the creation model based on biblical principles should be in every textbook. Those are the recommendations that they send to reviewers. Now, luckily, we know that the reviewers have stood firm and are refusing, or the textbook publishers are refusing to change their textbooks despite reviews that say that demand things like biblical creation, the creation model be taught. Now, that doesn't mean they will be adopted by the State Board of Education. There are creationists on the state board, and later in November, we're going to have a final vote to decide what books Texas adopts. And the State Board of Education in Texas needs to get calls and emails and be told to teach real science, and we want real science because this affects every single one of us who's worried about education in any state in this country. And the good news, we brought out hundreds of people. We have state board members on our side. We had a state board member come out to a Texas Freedom Network rally beforehand and simply say, evolution's real, I don't need to say more. We've had hundreds of thousands of people across the country call the Texas State Board, and we have a really big ace up our sleeve, and that is the former creationist president of the state board who lost his election a few years ago. Have any of y'all seen The Revisionaries? So the few of you who've seen The Revisionaries, remember Don McElroy? Don McElroy is a creationist dentist who led the charge against the science standards in Texas and helped mess those up the first time. But he lost his election. But he came back to the state board in September at the first meeting about the textbooks to testify. And he didn't do what the rest of his creationist fellows did, which is argue against the textbooks. He actually endorsed science textbooks. So we now have the head creationist asking for the science textbooks to be adopted, not for the same reasons we do. He thinks that the science standards he thinks there's no evidence for evolution and therefore the textbooks are wrong, and that's why we should adopt them.
Don McElroy, followed by Franklin Mail.
Well, thank you. Even though these biology books are full of unsubstantiated dogmatic statements supporting evolution, there are still two major reasons why you should adopt these books. First, by so doing, you will strike the final blow to the teaching of evolution. There are some hidden jewels in these texts just waiting to be mined by inquisitive students that can destroy evolution. In 2009, when the board adopted these new science standards, the evolutionists were painted into a corner. The authors were required to provide scientific evidence for explanations of the sudden appearance and stasis of groups in the fossil record and the complexity of the cell, and most importantly, to identify the specific pages where they were to do so. These sections are the hidden jewels. In the following week, American Association for the Advancement of Science reported new science standards for Texas schools strike a major blow to the teaching of evolution. The adoption of these books represents the final blow because despite their boastful assertions of robust evidence for evolution, when you actually read those identified sections, the hidden jewels, you will find the evidence incredibly weak to non-existent. And if there's no evidence, there's no evolution. Science, test explanations, classically with controlled experiments and historically by collecting evidence. Genetics is an excellent example of classical testability. Mendel, in 1865, after growing 29,000 pea plants, empirically deduced the laws of inheritance. Continental drift is an excellent example of historical testability. The obvious fit of the coastlines of Africa and South America, similar geologic formations, discovery of the mid-Atlantic ridge and seafloor spreading make a convincing argument. Likewise, evolution is tested historically. Evolutionists need a lot of evidence. How much? Simply they must provide enough to explain the origin of everything else in the book. Here's one book's index, 4,000 items. Here is one item, biochemical complexity. How much evidence do the authors provide? They just wave their magic wand of words and come up with some simple explanations. Just so stories. The second reason I ask you to adopt these books is because they happen consistently coincidentally to support what the Bible says. The Bible says God created all life after their kind. What we see in the world around us supports what the Bible says. We see myriads of things that replicate themselves and can be organized into distinct classifications.
Dr. McElroy, go ahead and finish. Since you were a former board member, we'll let you finish.
Well, I only got about 20 seconds.
That's true.
Not only does, what we see in the world around us supports what the Bible says. But what we see in these books supports what the Bible says. Test it for yourself. Open it random, any page, and ask yourself if the description and illustration you find supports the claims of the Bible or of evolution. Even the units on evolution support what the Bible says, because as demonstrated, they don't even support evolution. Ironically, evolutionists argue that creationists want to force their religious views in the text, but just the teaching of biology does that, and teaching evolution demonstrates that's not how God did it. Since true testable science trumps dogmatism, strike the final blow to the teaching of evolution, support the Bible, and adopt these books. Thank you.
All right, so let's pause it there. So Don McElroy is fairly confused about what the biology textbooks actually say and what they do, because we've had a large amount of experts go through them and say they're solid biology textbooks that teach evolution well. But we'll take that endorsement. If it undermines the creationist, I'm happy to have it. And so that's Texas. So we may have won this fight, I think. We have one more hearing. They still need to be called and told support evolution. I can throw in there support the Bible, support evolution, like Don McElroy. I mean, hey, we have the endorsement. So that's where Texas stands. Mr. McElroy is quite a character. You should go watch his. If you haven't watched their Visionaries, go watch it, or at least go watch all the stuff he's put online. His most famous moment is he thinks someone needs to stand up to the experts, and all those experts who think they know more about science than Mr. McElroy, and so he's doing that. And so the other hilarious thing about Texas, in Louisiana, they try and disguise this all with critical thinking. And they let slip what's going on every once in a while, and we've got enough statements from politicians about creationism. But in Texas, they don't even try and hide it. I mean, that was straight up, like, in that same meeting, someone comes up we had someone come to the mic, and they get asked a question about what they want taught, and without blinking, the guy just says biblical truth. And it's just like, well, there we have it, and you're like, and you can't even pretend it's not about creationism now. And so that's Texas, and in Louisiana we've been fighting to repeal this law. And again, this coalition we've built is unlike none in the world. We now have roughly 40% of living Nobel laureate scientists on board asking for a repeal of Louisiana's creationism law. We have dozens of major science organizations, tens of thousands of people from many different fields. We've had students come in, and we have the New Orleans City Council unanimously endorsed the repeal of this law because it's cost tourism to New Orleans and harms their students. The Orleans Parish School Board has banned the teaching of creationism in intelligent design based on this law. It's one parish with only 6 schools. But it's a sign that people are angry and mad. But we haven't won yet. And it would seem like, despite our progress, despite what we've done, it would seem like our Governor Bobby Jindal had done all he could do to harm science in Louisiana. I mean, you can't get much worse than a creationism law, right? I mean, I can't think of worse. Can y'all think of anything worse? Well, I mean, it would turn out you're wrong, though, because we passed a school voucher program last spring that is providing public funding, millions of dollars, to schools that teach creationism. And we've got schools in Louisiana that say things like scientists are sinful men, and the earth is not millions of years old, and scientists are really just trying to explain the world so they don't have to be morally accountable to God. That's what we're teaching. Or another school that mandates, in their school handbook, every student signs on, I will agree to this when they go to the school, they mandate defending creationism against traditional scientific theory, because who wants traditional scientific theory anyway, right? And so these schools were initially slated for about $11 million and 1,200 students their first year. That got reduced after it came out what they were teaching, but they still got about $4 million their first year. And more creationist schools have entered the program. It's now in its second year and continuing on. So it's now we're probably at $10 to $15 million to creationist schools right now in Louisiana through a voucher program. And again, I have to hammer this point again. This is not just a Louisiana problem. This is a national problem. There are 9 states in D.C. where we've identified over 300 schools, which represent hundreds of millions. It's probably hundreds of millions of dollars each year going to schools that teach creationism. And my favorite school is one in Florida. It calls Evolution the Way of the Heathen. There are about 160 schools, at least, in Florida teaching creationism and receiving public money. And there's schools in Indiana which take their kids on field trips across the border to Kentucky and go see the Creation Museum. And it's publicly funded. And another point to make is that this is just the tip of the iceberg. We found schools that, the schools we know about are schools that put on their website, we teach creationism. We use a curriculum that says dragons were real, they were dinosaurs that breathed fire out of glands in their nose and lived with humans. They put stuff like that on their website. There are probably a lot more schools that were smart enough to realize we're getting public money. Maybe we shouldn't put it on our website. And so they've sanitized all that off their websites. But they're still teaching creationism, and there's incredible amounts of money that are often taken out of our public schools to fund these schools. And so that's one more thing to add to the list to fight against beyond creationism laws. And oh, by the way, one of our state legislators in Louisiana who initially was going to vote for the voucher program, she was really confused. There was a Muslim school in the program, and she didn't understand that, because when she initially got involved, she thought that funding religious schools meant solely Christian schools. And so she had to withdraw her support after that because she couldn't fund a Muslim school. Now, the saddest part about that story is after there was a lot of public pressure, especially from politicians on that school, and it withdrew from the program. I dislike the program. I think the program's unconstitutional and wrong, but I think it should have stayed in there because, I mean, it's only fair if we're funding religious schools. I mean, we might as well fund them all, and public pressure bullying one school out of the program based on their views is fairly wrong and awful. But it does show a lot about our politicians. And so with all this sort of bad news, why are we fighting this fight? Why don't we just, I mean, I hear from a lot of people pretty continually, just give up. Like, you're in the South, Louisiana's backwater, like, we'll just send all the stupid people there and be away, and let's kick them out of the United States. I hear stuff like that every day, and just because it's hard to fight these things because no one wants to deal with it, and that's the wrong attitude. And I want to remind people of the quote that President Kennedy gave when he launched the space race, and he said this really sheds light on why we do things. I mean, it's sciencey. It's sort of what we want to do with our future, and also it sheds light on why we do things. And so he said we choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. It really says it all, doesn't it? Like, we don't fight this because it's easy and we we think the creationists are about to lie down and say, sorry, you got us. We're no longer brainwashed. We're going to stop messing with children. And we're just going to go, we're going to leave and stop doing this. They're not going to do that. They show up every year. The Discovery Institute flies down lobbyists from Seattle down to Louisiana to testify. They have tons of money. They have votes on their side. And we really need to build that on our side and fight back, because it's not easy, but it has to happen. And that's why we don't sit back after we lose in Louisiana and say, oh, we fought a good fight, now we're going to give up. That's not how things work. And so the last point, we need to fight the anti-science. We need to fight attacks on climate change, on evolution, on anything that has to do with science, on stem cells. We need to be teaching that, and we need to be making sure we're doing science. But the other big problem in America, we get to blame the House Republicans for this, is that we've slashed science funding. We've absolutely decimated science funding. And so even if we were to be teaching our kids science right now, even if we were to be teaching kids evolution and climate change, so we have now these antibiotic resistant bacteria. We need kids who know evolution to fight that. But even if we taught them that, if we're not funding their research, it doesn't matter anyway, because they won't be able to do science. And so we've cut $80 billion over 10 years from science research and development because of the budget sequester. And this is not coming from this is not that we've been funding more and more and then we just sort of tone that back down. We've been in science funding has been mostly stagnant for a decade, except for the stimulus in 2008. It's been mostly stagnant, and then we've cut $80 billion. And that's where we stand. The average age for people receiving grants for scientific research has risen from 34 to 44 in the last year. And by the most recent numbers, 20% of American scientists are considering leaving the country to look for funding elsewhere. That's where we stand. This is, in many ways, to me, a scarier issue than not teaching science is a huge problem. It's just awful, but this is even scarier to me because we're not funding. America is built on science, and it will no longer be if we keep the status quo. That we will destroy ourselves. And so these are the two things we need to fight to change. And it won't be easy. We're not going to convince Ted Cruz and Lamar Alexander, the head of the House, I'm blanking on his name, sorry, but the head of the House Science Committee who doesn't. Do you remember the bill recently where he wanted to make science funding America only go to American science, and only science that could support America could be done? And so it's just an anti-science, foolish attitude. And these people are not going to lie down and say, oh, we're going to give up. We have to fight them. We have to make sure we're teaching science. We have to make sure we're funding science. That's what I'm calling the second giant leap, because, again, after the first one where we went to the moon, the first giant leap humankind had, we need a new one. We've really changed our attitude since then. And so I hope you all will join me in this. I don't know how much time I have left to take questions, but I am happy to answer any that y'all have. And thank you all so much for having me here.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes for questions. If you'd like to queue at the microphone here and give your question to Zack Kopplin.
So I have a quick correction and then 2 short questions. The correction, welcome to Texas, by the way. I look forward to seeing you.
It's been a few years now.
A month and a half or so, you'll be down in my neighborhood. They didn't actually remove Thomas Jefferson from history. They removed him from one list of late 18th and 19th century writers who were influential in starting revolutions, and they replaced him with John Calvin and Thomas Aquinas, which is just... They might as well have removed him. First question is, how'd you get so awesome? And the second question is, what are you going to be doing next, and how can we help?
So the first step for right now is we're trying to get a nonprofit up and running. That's a slow, miserable process, I've learned. And it's not very fun to deal with the IRS and deal with IRS forms. It's not very easy. So that's one step. But the next step, we're about to be pushing out, more aggressive work on advocating for science funding, because we sort of have a handle on what's involved with fighting the bad education legislation, the National Center for Science Education. By the way, if you want to know about the fight against or fight for evolution, look up the National Center for Science Education. They do amazing work. They've been doing this for 30 years. Their website has any resource you would ever need on evolution. And so, but we know it's sort of a game of whack-a-mole where they introduce new legislation, we smack it down, they pass something, we have to repeal it, and we keep playing this game. And we know what to do there, but there's no real organized resistance to the funding problems. And so that's where we need to start right now. And so I'm going to hopefully have a petition soon that we're going to start circulating through things like Change and Move On and sending around to people, and hopefully we can build a national movement surrounding that. So that's the next step on what new is happening. And any other questions?
Did you get any blowback from your school?
I was very, very lucky, and my school was sort of in a bubble, and my classmates and teachers were all very supportive of me. And the thing for me is this actually was a school project where it started. I had a senior project to graduate from high school, and I took this on as my senior project. And so my school was very, very supportive. And my biology teachers, some of them were fairly religious, but they were all very confused how people couldn't accept evolution and have their faith at the same time. It's all very silly that we have a creationism law. All right.
Why is this not being fought at the federal level?
So he said, why is this not being followed at the federal level? And I assume you mean why haven't we filed a lawsuit? So the problem with a lawsuit is that what we have is sort of a macro level understanding of what's going on under the Louisiana Science Education Act. We know what parishes are doing. We know what the legislative sponsors are saying. We know what it's meant for. We know the people behind it are all the religious right. But this is sort of what it takes to fight the law. What we need is a plaintiff. And to find a plaintiff is going to be very hard because you have to find someone who, A, knows that creationism is wrong, and then knows that, B, their rights are being violated if they're taught it, C, that they're opposed to that, because you're going to have kids who don't know better and say, okay, I'm happy that creationism is being taught. And then once you get there, the highest bar of all is to find someone who's got the guts to stand up and sue the law. And so many of y'all may know about Damon Fowler, right? He was a kid in Louisiana who challenged his graduation prayer. And he found himself thrown out of his house. He needed police protection at his graduation. And really just it destroyed his normal life that he'd been going through. And people know that their community, that their family, people will be really angry. And you've got to have someone who has real courage in some parts of Louisiana to stand up and face what's going to come to them for fighting these laws. And no one's come out with that. No one's gotten to the point where they're willing to come out and challenge this like that. And so I would love to find someone. I mean, I'm always waiting. And right now we are suing the State Department of Education in Louisiana to know what's going on, because we know they have information on what's going on that they've been unwilling to give us and unwilling to provide to the public. And so when that's resolved, we'll know a lot more and then know hopefully which schools are teaching what and be able to pursue it more deeply. But it's not an easy process to get there, because it's going to take either a really gutsy kid in some high school in Monroe, Louisiana, or it's going to take a series of lawsuits to get public records to even get there and find a kid like that. So.
I had a question. In previous cases in Arkansas, and I think in the Dover case in Pennsylvania, they had support from the ACLU. And have you had any support from the ACLU? Yeah, the
ACLU, Americans United, all those type of groups are on our side. They've always been on our side.
And my other question was, I know in Arkansas, there have been faith groups who have opposed the teaching of creationism in schools, and that was they joined in the lawsuits. And I was wondering if you've tried to get from some more liberal faith groups to find support there.
We actually have some fairly broad support from faith groups. So the Clergy Letter Project is a great resource for anyone who's trying to sort of, if you're talking to someone, the three things I use. First, the quote from Pope John Paul, which is, "There's no conflict between evolution and the doctrine of faith." I give that to a lot of Catholics who don't really know, because I guess there's certain issues to address first. So intelligent design and creationism. A lot of people hear intelligent design and think that means, oh, I believe evolution was caused by God. That's not what it means. Intelligent design is a specific rejection of the theory of evolution. You have to make people aware of that. And I tend not to fight with people over what they believe. I just say, look, if you accept evolution and you're religious, then you believe in theistic evolution and you're on our side. But don't support intelligent design, because it's a specific rejection of evolution that was basically, it's creationism renamed with some of the more obvious parts taken out, like 6,000 years old. That's all it is. So that's the first thing that you need to make people aware of that, because it was a brilliant strategy by the creationists. Name it one thing that sounds like something else, and then you misinform the public and appear to have a lot broader support than you actually have. It's what they've done. And so that's one thing. So the quote from Pope John Paul will help with a lot of people if you want to illustrate that point to them. Then the Clergy Letter Project is about 15,000 clergy members now who've signed on and said they strongly support teaching of evolution in science classrooms in public schools. And the last group, the last person who's fairly close to y'all, is Reverend Welton Gaddy in Monroe, Louisiana. He runs Interfaith Alliance. It's a national group. It works on a lot of separation of church and state issues, and Welton Gaddy is wonderful and has been fairly helpful to us in our fight against creationism in Louisiana. And so if you need a religious group on your side, call him because he'll help out. And I guess while we're on list of people to have on your side, the creationists like to bring out this list they call Dissent from Darwin. It's about 800 people that have signed on to a list saying they dissent from Darwin. The problem with this is they're mostly not biologists, mostly not qualified in the field. And so the National Center for Science Education decided to respond. People have been telling them, well, make a list of scientists. And they said, well, we don't really want to play the game of whose list of scientists is longer. Because the science is not decided by whose list is longer. That's not how science works. And secondly, our list is all the scientists minus a few hundred. And 99.9% accept evolution. And so what they did is they made a list of people named Steve in honor of Steve Gould, who signed on to a contrary statement supporting evolution. And they now they're approaching twice the size, they're on their way to twice the size of the Dissent from Darwin list of only people named Steve, who are scientists, who have signed on to their list. And it's worth noting that Steves are about 1% of the population. They have more biologists by far, and they have more eminent scientists on their list than this Dissent from Darwin list. So it's always a good one to pull that out when the creationists start trying to say, oh, we look at it when they pull out scientists, or they say, well, we've got these scientists on our side, or they also like to quote mine scientists. It's a good list to pull out.
All right, thank you, Zack Kopplin.